Hello and welcome to the Green Innovation Group podcast. Today I have the honor of having a guest in the studio. Luisa, welcome to the show for the second time. So welcome back, I might say. The last time you were here, you gave the introduction to the microbiome. Since you're something that I may or may not call it a scientist, but let's just call it a powerhouse of knowledge that is studying the microbiome. I've been doing a lot of thinking on sort of the complexity of what the microbiome is, and just to briefly elaborate, you explained to me that the microbiome starts when you're born. That's when we start recruiting bacteria and microorganisms for our microbiome. We do that in the first 3 years of the human life, approximately. Then there's little subtle changes, and towards the end of our lives, or when we hit the end of the journey and grow old, the microbiome is losing diversity and becomes more homogeneous, and that results in us actually aging faster towards the end of the life, or having that effect that we have a poor immune system, and a lot of this business about being human gets more difficult.
Yeah, you can say in the end you lose some of that protectiveness because you lose those microbes who gave you protection when you get older.
And the microbiome is a colony that is unique or almost unique to every person or every human, and only approximately 10% is the same from one person to the next. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge difference between one person's microbiome and the others, and it may or may not, but that's one of the things you're working on, investigating whether or not it actually dictates behavior, as the microbiome is also helping produce certain proteins that help us produce hormones, and can actually influence quite a lot of things, immune responses, pathogenic responses, and the list seems to be very long and ever growing the more we talk about this. I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around it. You told me sort of in between these episodes is that there's a project called the Human Microbiome Project. And I think that would be a great place to start, because I was thinking that if we can map our genetics, we're fairly confident within sort of that science now as a society. But when we're looking at a microbiome, there's thousands and thousands of different individual microorganisms and a very large degree of diversity. So how might we as a society wrap our heads around this hyper-complex issue? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the project you mentioned, the Human Microbiome Project, it looks into our microbiome, and that would be, for example, the oral microbes, the vaginal microbes, the skin microbes, the gut microbes, and so on. And it is a project that is trying to create a catalog, the way we now have a human genome catalog, where we, in the future, potentially could go and see where does my microbiome map to that? And am I within the norm? Like, am I normal? Because we do believe that some microbiomes, and particularly in the gut, may be unhealthy and therefore cause more disease and trouble compared to others.
What would an example be of something that could be caused by the microbiome?
Mm-hmm. So, for example, there is a bacteria called Helicobacter. It's a specific genus of bacteria. And it is a bacteria that lives in our gut, and it can potentially give you cancer, or it can protect you, like help you, for example, against allergies, if I remember correctly. But it definitely has benefits as well. So it's very interesting since it's able to do both. So it would be one of those opportunistic pathogens that I mentioned and defined in the previous episode. So that would be one example. We also have another genus called Enterococcus. That is
you know it, as you know and love.
That's another one living in the gut that produce some of these metabolites and compounds that can also affect our behavior and health and so on. So there are billions of others that I could give examples of, but I don't think it would necessarily engraft the listeners and potentially viewers in what it is and what it does. And I do think that the mission of the Human Microbiome Project is to make everyone understand that and to enable us to get a healthier microbiome. Yeah.
Okay, so they're actually trying to wrestle this beast of a challenge it must be to map out. I mean, you also explained in the previous episode that it's not just bacteria, it's also a lot of things that are very long, complicated words, amongst other very small and not so complicated worms, but they may or may not be even more complex than we think. And I just call it microorganisms because it's easy for me to remember.
Yeah.
So if we have sort of these 4 overall categories of microorganisms, I believe it was. Can you go over them again?
Yeah, I think there are more than just 4, but I instead want to just highlight bacteria and fungi and viruses. But the fungi could also be other type of eukaryotic microbes. But I particularly want to highlight the viruses here because recent research actually shows that they can have just as huge an impact on behavior, health, and disease in humans, just like we thought bacteria they could and they can. For example, there was someone looking into, I believe it was a type of insect, I can't remember right now what type, but they were quite confident that this insect was having this type of behavior, I think it was related to mating, because of a bacteria. And it turned out it wasn't the bacteria actually doing this, but a virus, because it was bacteriophages, which is a specific type of virus that only targets and kills bacteria, that was able to go in and kill these bacteria that then would give the behavioral change in the insect.
Wow.
So it's very complicated, and we do believe that the viruses are just as important to look at and consider in the microbiome, and like bacteria, for example.
And when you say we, is that, generally speaking, the field of general scientists and researchers that are working on this topic, or is it your department specifically?
No, this is actually everyone in microbiome research. And I always try to, when I say we, to refer to the majority of scientists within my field, and not just what we work on in my center.
And your center being?
The Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics, which is founded by the Danish National Research Foundation.
Yeah, so easy to remember and spell and talk about and share those names at the dinner table, so feel very welcome to do that. And pretend that you know what it means. And then
that would be so cool.
You'll look super clever.
Yes, very so.
So, sort of when we have this catalog from the Human Microbiome Project, and they, let's say that they succeed in mapping out the majority of the microorganisms in the bacteria, the fungi, the vira that we have in our microbiomes. Well, I mean, how big of a task would it be to map the microbiome of one individual?
I think that's a tough question, because right now it would be quite demanding, but if you have resources enough, it doesn't necessarily have to be either. But we are facing some challenges regarding the computational analysis and statistics as well. The modeling, trying to understand these networks and how it's all combined, because there are quite many components in this, right? We have the animal or the host, us as a human individual. Then we have the microbes, we have the environment, and then we have a specific behavior or disease or element of health we want to look at. So trying to connect these 4 in one study can be quite complex. And we currently don't have an established approach that would cover them all in an unbiased and rigorous way. I do believe that's coming. I actually just recently have been writing a manuscript trying to develop such an approach so we could look at it in a more unbiased and systematic way. But yeah, it's a tricky question to answer.
It sounds like almost a mathematical impossibility.
Well, I definitely believe it is possible, but it's true, we would need some mathematicians, and I'm not that person.
Mm-hmm. So we need the computational power, and we need some smart people to talk about Euler spheres and something, and do some random matrix stuff, and then we'll be able to start learning something. And that basically what we agreed we should cover today in this episode is the transition from the current sick care regime that we have in the healthcare sector at large into a preventive care system. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we care about that in Green Innovation Group is because we're here to help decarbonize the healthcare sector at large. Mm-hmm. And a huge element here is, of course, to make sure we have fewer patients, because the best patient is the one that never develops the need for a complex treatment or for hospitalization or heavy treatment with drugs that are polluting to produce, etc. And to put some numbers to that, right now the healthcare sector at large emits just around 6% of all global emissions, and that corresponds actually to the emissions of aviation and shipping combined. It also corresponds to the emissions of, you could go on and name a whole list of countries that it would add up to. And when you're sort of taking those factors in and you're looking at something like the Hippocratic Oath, that doctors swear that they can do no harm, that's first and foremost do no harm, then it's ironic that we don't have sort of a view on the patient and a view on the environment at the same time, because the environment is also a very crucial part of this holistic picture, where actually for a very long time we've been able to do a lot of harm in treating patients. That's sort of the fly into why we care about preventive care. And when we have something that is at the frontier of scientific research, like the microbiome is, we discussed in the last episode how this field has just recently emerged in the past 20 or 30 years. Of course, this is super interesting because it holds such a large potential without us necessarily knowing what are the emissions associated to developing these treatments and these cures, but I suppose that's something that could be factored in when developing new solutions. So the overall sort of umbrella theme here is the preventive care angle. And you and I discussed this in sort of the pre-production of this episode, and you said, well, Fred, I don't have any CO2 emission figures associated to this because it's just not done in large scale. So we don't know a lot about sort of what will be the environmental cost associated to, say, doing a fecal transplantation or isolating and producing a bacterial strain or whatever we may sort of conjure in the realm of therapeutics. What we do know is, or what has been estimated by the National Health System in National Health Services in the UK, is the emissions in CO2 equivalents associated to a range of different things. So, say 1 hour of surgery is around 53 kilos of CO2 equivalent. A 24-hour day in an intensive care unit. Say you have the coronavirus and you need to go into intensive care. 24 hours of intensive care is around 103 kilos of CO2, and a consultation with a general practitioner, a physician or a doctor is just around 1.3 kilos, if I remember correctly. So some of these figures we actually do have, and sort of so I would suggest that we just accept that as the premises for the discussion that we're having now, that there are quite tangible emissions associated to having the sick care system, where a patient feels ill, is sort of somehow introduced into the healthcare system and then receiving treatment one way or another. You know, maybe it's intensive care, maybe it's just going to the doctor and then getting a drug prescribed, or then getting penicillin or antibiotics, or whatever may be sort of the patient journey. There's reason to believe that preventive care will be significantly less emission intensive because it removes the need for having the patient sort of bedbound in a hospital.
Yeah, exactly. For hospitalization and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's very intensive.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting is, for example, looking at antibiotics, as you just mentioned. It's something we need when you're infected, but it's also something we need for just doing a surgery that you gave an example of, right? And we are facing a crisis of multiple bacterial strains developing immunity, as resistance against antibiotics. So I think it's very important, and actually also urgent, for us to try to look at how to prevent getting the illness and how to prevent even using antibiotics, right? And the reason why I also am so fascinated with microbiome research is that I believe that we can develop microbiota-specific therapeutics. So for example, we will be able to discover and produce metabolites or other products that microbes they produce that helps us stay healthy. And I think that that could be a huge way to make sure that we don't get sick, that you don't need, you know, to go to the hospital because of Crohn's disease or something else like that, that we do now think may be correlated with the gut microbiome. So I see there are many ways on how to help, you know, prevent diseases. Also in relation to allergy, I read a study recently where they could show that the gut microbes in mice, they specifically could help upregulate your own genes that would then prevent you from getting an allergic reaction that strong that you would need to be hospitalized. So,
wow.
Yeah, so it is a field where I do hope it will take us there, where we can get rid of, you know, so many of these doctor visits and hospitalizations and illnesses that are currently existing.
When we're looking at this, I mean, I think it's difficult to understand. So how would we go about that? Would we go to a lab and then identify a bacteria that has certain properties that we would want to sort of multiply and harvest and turn into a pill or an injectable or a biologic or whatever would be sort of the solution? How would you go about that in sort of, can you explain that to me like a 5-year-old? What would that process look like?
Well, I think you just explained it yourself, because it's very spot on how I see it. I mean, we already today in many pharmacies can find probiotics, which are live organisms, microorganisms put in a pill, right? Mm-hmm. However, the research isn't stable yet. We haven't seen that taking probiotics can solely make you healthy. So it really also falls back on how our microbiome is developed when we're young. Mm-hmm. And I think it already begins there. And I also do think that we might see in the future that for you to get and have a healthier gut microbiome and microbiome in general, you would also have to do some changes in your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So it also falls back on these like already very boring and annoying things we know, such as exercise, eat healthy. Yes, I know, but it really also affects your gut microbiome, and it can help you have a healthy gut microbiome if doing those things.
So how, I mean, I think
there's no really shortcut. I mean, it's unfortunately the situation.
And what does it mean? I mean, when we're, I mean, I suppose you're basically saying that we have reason to believe that it helps moving. Humans are probably made or designed to move and be healthy. In order to be healthy, we need to move. I think that's a fair assumption. I think, evolutionary speaking, that's probably been an advantage for any respiratory organism to move. Because if not, we would probably be better to conserve energy than other organisms can do that. And eat healthy. That's just sticking with me a bit, because as a consultant that works a lot with decarbonization, one of the key challenges that we're facing as a society is, of course, the consumption of animal-based proteins, because it's inherently unsustainable that you take a lot of calories and then you put them through an animal filter and you get fewer calories out on the other end. And don't get me wrong, I've eat meat myself, but I would actually prefer for it not to being an option in many cases, right? Because it
have the temptation removed.
Exactly. When I have the debate with myself, it's just because it's tasty. I mean, I don't think there's a business case for it being healthy. And ethically speaking, I think it's very hard to defend. And when we know what's going on with antibiotics as well in husbandry, then there's a very good case for sort of reconsidering how that is a part of our diet. But when you, as an expert on the microbiome, and I hope you're confident wearing that title here, when you say it's important to eat healthy, what does it mean to eat healthy?
Okay, that is an area where I'm not an expert, like I am with microbiomes, but not necessarily what you eat. But I have read up on it, and I've also looked at it in relation to microbiome research, right? And we do know that it is good for you not to eat animal products.
Always the same.
Yeah, I know. I'm just as annoying as many other experts I'm sure you've talked to. I mean, it just is very much correlated and even causally related to diseases. So the same goes for the microbiomes. I believe that some researchers actually discovered that if you eat a lot of animal products, you may even be having colonized microbes that are considered more pathogenic or more unhealthy. And they would then produce small compounds that are unhealthy for you as well. So instead of having good microbes that produce good compounds for you, you could then, if eating a lot of animal products, have the bad ones that produce bad compounds for you as well.
So they could make you depressed or stressed, or what kind of, what are we looking at here? We talked about the serotonin producer, the sort of the building blocks, serotonin being the happy hormone. So what are we looking at here with the bad building blocks that you're referring to here?
Well, it's again about the composition, right? Because there are billions of microbes in our guts that all have an influence. So it's really about how the abundance is. So if you, for example, when looking at obesity, you would see that many who are obese, they have, if I remember correctly, an increased number of the bacteria called Akkermansia, compared to those who are not obese. So it's those things we're looking at, but we can't yet say specifically, you know what, it's because of Akkermansia and it produces this and that, which is connected to this and that metabolism, which then results in you having this behavior of overeating and doing We're not there yet, unfortunately. So,
but we all, I mean, I feel like you also illustrated just how complex the variation of different bacteria and microorganisms in different sort of even areas like the oral, the vaginal, the skin, the armpits. So is there a point in kind of trying to look mostly at the gut microbiome, so you kind of fence out the playing field and say, okay, now we're trying to just insulate only looking at the gut, which is hyper complex, but let's just keep it at that, or let's only look at oral microbiome. Is that sort of also a scientific methodological point?
I would say so, and I actually even remember reading someone saying that your oral microbiome could determine or say whether or not you would get cancer. like, or something
Wow.
like that. It was like crazy, the correlation they had made to the oral microbiome and disease. But I do believe that the gut microbiome is the most important microbiome to look at when looking at humans and health and disease, because we do know that the gut is physically connected to our brain and that they can communicate to each other.
You have neurons in the gut, right?
Yes, we do. And so they communicate to one another, our gut and brain, and therefore the gut microbes, they can also communicate with the gut epithelial, so the gut cells we have, but also the brain. So although the microbe itself can't go directly to the brain and be like, hi, be happy now, it can definitely send some molecules that can do that.
Yeah, so it can sort of provide some of the building blocks for getting there.
Exactly. So they have an influence on behavior and health and diseases. It's just not mapped yet in a way where I can tell you, go home, do this, do that, take that bacteria and avoid that virus, then you're good to go. It's unfortunately not there we are yet in the research.
But do exercise, do attempt to eat healthy in whichever interpretation you have
Yeah,
of that.
and try to, if possible, to avoid antibiotics because it does kill your gut microbes. Not necessarily all of them, but it might kill many of them, and also do, suddenly then create space for bad microbes to then dominate. Or
yeah, so it can remove a lot of the beneficial bacteria.
Exactly. But I have to add, please don't now, if you have a bladder infection at home, stop taking your antibiotics, because I'm sure it's prescribed for a reason, and we're quite good in Denmark not to just give it here and there. However, I myself try to, when I'm now young and healthy, not to just take it if, for example, I go to the dentist and get removed the teeth. Then I remember getting from my dentist, here is some antibiotic, take it. I didn't, because I was like, okay, if I develop an infection, then I will take it. But if I don't, then why would I?
The preventive antibiotics is,
yeah.
That's a curious point on the preventive care, because preemptive antibiotics is something that's quite prevalent in animal production, where we actually, by length, the largest consumption of antibiotics on a global level is for animal production. And I think this could be a provocative statement for a lot of folks out there to hear that animal products are not necessarily good for your gut. They're not necessarily good for the planet. They're actually proven to be quite terrible for both. And I think there's been such an intense lobby effort from animal produce interest organizations that to many it could actually ring false, and then I would just invite sort of the opinion, because I think it provides a very clear perspective. How about tobacco? Does that have any influence on your gut?
It actually does. I don't recall the specifics of it, but I have remembered reading studies that showed that. And I think overall, it's really just thinking of your gut as a part of you. So whatever you do, whatever you eat, drink, whatever you're exposed to of environment, it affects your gut as well. I'm sure we've all traveled somewhere, and just being in an airplane could mess with your gut a little. So it really all affects you.
So your gut is also your temple?
It is.
And don't smoke in it.
No, exactly.
Okay, but what I was fishing for was basically kind of, I don't think many would be provoked from that statement associated to tobacco consumption.
Yes.
Today,
no, I think you're right. I think you're right. But it's so tricky, because it really demands a lot to ask someone to change their own behavior and lifestyle. And it's also a sensitive topic, right? Because someone might be feeling, okay, so you're telling me I'm doing it wrong, this is what I was doing my entire life, and I haven't been taught anything differently from my parents or in school and so on. And I myself eat very plant-based. I can't say I'm a vegan, but I really try to be. And so it's a journey I went on years ago, and it took me a while before I even got there, before I was happy reducing my amount of animal production.
I was pissed off when I was vegetarian. I got so angry and furious, mostly because the options that you're presented with,
yeah,
are just straight up bad most of the time,
Yeah.
and it feels like you're sort of you're walking with the cross that you didn't really ask to carry, but there's presented so few alternatives that it ended up being a very frustrating experience for me. I was vegetarian for many years actually, but when we're looking at sort of the status of the microbiome and sort of preventive care, it's very clear that this is a scientific field that is in its early stages. So we don't know much right now, but we can develop hypotheses, and we can guesstimate certain things. And some of the things that you've talked about is that there could potentially be therapeutics developed in a whole range of different chronic disease areas, especially those related to the brain.
But also related to the immune system, just to add that.
Yeah, like the allergies would of course
yes, exactly.
qualify there.
Yeah.
So we've talked about potential for treating Alzheimer's, treating autism, treating dementia, and you know all of these things. So what do you think? What's the timeline for us? When will this become the norm?
I quickly want to add to that I actually even read that sleeping is good for your gut microbiome too. So like, it's not just you that needs sleep, but also your gut microbes.
I'm going to add that to the what can you do today.
Yes, and apparently when you sleep, your gut microbes sleep too. It's so funny to me that that's even a possibility.
That's the thing.
But I mean, related to dementia and the other diseases you mentioned, they're actually very much related to how much sleep you get. So sleeping now is actually very important to try to avoid developing those diseases later. And regarding the gut microbes within these diseases, unfortunately my answer again is quite short, that we don't know the specifics yet, but it is just so important to try to keep a healthy gut microbiome, because it most certainly in some way or another is connected to these diseases too.
I think that's a premises that most will be able to buy into. But when we're looking at sort of the timelines that are there, so in the past 20 years, say you're saying the field has emerged in the recent times, right? So how far have we come in the last 20 years, and how far do you expect we will get in the next 20 years?
Well, in the past 20 years, we went from not even knowing that we have gut microbes and we have skin microbes and so on, and that this microbiome we possess is actually good for us. We didn't really know that. And we didn't know the quantity of them and how important they are in relation to our health, disease, and behavior. So what I think we can see the next 20 years is specifically how, when, and who does affect each behavior, health, and disease. I think those are the next steps we're going to see. And of course, it will also depend on us continuing developing the right technologies to it, because why this field emerged 20 years ago, more or less, was because of the development of sequencing, the next generation sequencing. And it's a type of copy machine that can take one small piece of DNA and multiply it to millions of copies of that exact same DNA molecule. So we are now seeing that new techniques are developed to help us better understand the microbes and what they do and what their genome looks like. And that is something sequencing, for example, can help us with, because it can suddenly go from copying these small DNA molecules to maybe copying longer DNA molecules, which would then more precisely tell us what's going on. Whereas we right now have to like make a puzzle connecting all of these small DNA molecules again.
So let me just get that straight. So sequencing is something we do essentially to copy a molecule. And the reason why we want to copy it, is that to use it or is that to observe it?
It's to use it. So when we have a sample, let's say we wanted to look into your gut microbiome, we would take your feces, and if possible, we would also like a small biopsy of your gut, maybe even several parts of your gut. So we could see which microbes are living in your gut cells, like are on your gut cells. And then we would try to extract DNA from your gut tissue and from your feces. And that would be the DNA we then sequenced, that we then copied. And the reason why we need to copy it is because the amount, the concentration of DNA that is there is so low that we can't fully look at it and understand it. We need to enlarge it in a mass that is possible for us to play with. So that's why we use this copy machine sequencing.
I think I get it. I don't think I get it, but I feel like I have a clearer picture of it. So thanks for that. If we try and kind of envision by the year 2040, do you think we'll be able, will the Human Microbiome Project, will it have succeeded in mapping the majority of the diversity of microbiomes in humans?
I hope so, and I think it's possible, but it's so hard to say with confidence. But some of the things that they have provided of results already now is something that we can implement and hopefully could then, you know, later on in 2040 show us the results. For example, let's say they have discovered that if you give antibiotics early to the kids when they're between 1 to 3 years old, they get their microbiome completely changed. Some bacteria die. Some believe that that has a negative effect later in life and that it can, for example, give you allergies and other diseases. And that's not something we necessarily know right now if it's true, but we could, for example, track those kids who had those antibiotic treatments now between the age of 1 to 3 and then see in 2040 how many have allergies, how many have other diseases, how healthy are they, how are they behaving, and so on. And maybe by then, when looking at the well-established catalog, we could maybe say, okay, that actually turned out to be the case.
So let's stop doing that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. So I think that's a very interesting point, because when sort of the thing that I can think of and compare it to is the way, like the discovery of DNA and genes. And today, mapping a genome is something that can be done for $100 or a couple of $100. So if we had sort of told a DNA scientist 30 years ago, when I grew up, I had a cable telephone, and we had sort of the dial switch where you had to kind of dial the number every time, and you know, on a little wheel. I remember having classes about DNA in early biology class in primary school. And I think if anyone at that point in time had said that by the year 2015, a company called 23andMe is going to make genome mapping accessible for the public at a cutthroat price that is, I mean, it's
affordable.
It's going to be affordable, and it's going to be comparable to the price of having a good dinner at a restaurant. Do you think it's feasible in 20 years from now that will be the case for the microbiome? Are we going to have cheap mapping options available?
I definitely think so, but it actually is possible already now. The way you mentioned we map the human genome is also the way we map the microbiome. So I think it's even feasible now. However, I think in the future it will be way better because this field is relatively new, and so it will be much more feasible to say, you know, I got today my microbiome sequence and I have this and that, which I know now affects why I've been having, I don't know, allergies towards gluten. So I definitely think that it could be, absolutely.
So there's a chance that maybe we can even have it as part of the recruitment strategy in H&R departments, that they can see if a certain person has a microbiome that dictates a behavior that they would want culturally to have.
Yeah,
in
instead
their
of the personality test trying to find leaders, they're now using the microbiome to see who's dominant, who could become the leader.
we're not doing 16 personalities, we're just doing a trillion microbiomes.
Exactly. You just give me your poop and we'll analyze it. Then
yeah,
we'll
that's a very awkward job interview.
Yes,
we can
so.
get into that. That's really fascinating to just try and think about, sort of in a preventive care setting. What is it we will have to do? And of course, a lot of it will be the boring stuff. And I think that's also a sort of a point that goes back to a lot of the work that we're doing within decarbonization, that a lot of combating climate change is quite boring. It's about using green energy and not burning fossil fuels. Boring. And it's about eating plant-based and not animal-based. And that's also boring. It's about not flying places, which we would like to do. It's about reducing our harmful activities, basically, and that goes into this point as well, that you bring up, that exercise, eat healthy, and sleep, and then on top of that, maybe some smart people like some of your colleagues or yourself will develop a therapeutic or a bacterial strain that can help with a few chronic diseases potentially down the line. But of course, therapeutic development is usually a 10-year timeline from being discovered and put into clinical trials and such.
Yeah.
So of course we are looking at a very long horizon here, especially with such an emerging field as we are looking at.
The journey that we're going on, it involves the microbiome, and it definitely has a central saying when it comes to preventive healthcare. So it's worth looking into and remembering this. And I really do think that if not considering it and if not putting money and effort into this research, we will miss out something completely unique and revolutionizing for our health. So, and also not even our health, but I would even say, going back to the climate, like also knowing how to conserve certain organisms and species, and also know how to, if the worst case should be, how to reestablish and recreate a species in the future that we have now. It's very important to know their microbiome too, if wanting to do that successfully. For example, we know that koalas, I don't know if I'm saying that right in English.
Koalas?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, they're cute, and they also eat a lot of toxic leaves. And they're not able to, actually digest these leaves, but their gut microbes are. So imagine if we only had the DNA of the koala and we then wanted to, recreate them, then we wouldn't be able to, because we wouldn't have their gut microbes. But now, because we do know that they're connected in this way, we can as well, by introducing the gut microbes too, reintroduce the entire organism. And I think that's a cool thought as well, that it's not just within healthcare, that this has potential, but also outside of it.
And if we ever want to create a Jurassic Parc in real life, we're going to need the microbiome of the dinosaurs mapped out, and that.
I mean,
I'm not sure which point I'm trying to make, but I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. In summary, preventive care is one of the application potentials for this research when it is more thoroughly mapped out, and the Human Microbiome Project is the most extensive mapping project in attempting to map out the human microbiome. And we have come a long way since around year 2000 with the deployment and discovery of sequencing. And in the coming decades, we are going to get a lot more sophisticated also in terms of the development of computational power. We are going to be able to know and observe many more correlation and causations, I suppose, and That'll enable us to develop new therapeutics, especially for chronic disease, especially for autoimmune diseases and anything associated to the brain. Does that?
I think that was a very good wrap up.
Cool. Thanks a lot for being here, and thanks for listening in or watching if you're watching. Feel free to comment, share, like, give us feedback so we can get even better or cover topics that tickles your fancy. We're always quite open to that, or if you have someone you would love for us to get on the show, we're also very open to that. And again, thank you so much for being here, Luisa. And
thank you.
If you ever feel like coming back, I feel like we can squeeze in covering a bit more of this topic.
Yeah, and maybe I could even like do some calculations on how specific treatments or specific things within the microbiome research is directly connected to the carbon emission.
That would be super cool. I mean, then you have a free ticket.
Good to know. Thanks.
Cheers.